So a new US-Russia negotiated peace plan for the war in Ukraine has been leaked to the US media. What is in this proposed plan and what does it mean for the future direction of the Russo-Ukrainian war? So Steve Witkoff, who is Donald Trump's special envoy, not just to Gaza and that really complex and brutal conflict, but also to the Russo-Ukrainian war. And he met with a Russian envoy, Dmitriev, and they hammered out a new peace plan. I'm using air quotes for peace plan because in reality it is a Russian appeasement plan, basically. And it is not very different in substance to what Russia proposed to Ukraine back in around March 2022 when their invasion of February 24th, 2022 was clearly stalled. They had some negotiations in Istanbul, or actually they were in Minsk first, and basically they proposed what would be in effect a capitulation plan for Ukraine. It would give huge concessions to Russia. It's not a full surrender in the sense that the Russians would have been running up their flag in the center of Kyiv, but it does position Russia to make substantial gains diplomatically, ones that here in late 2025 they have not been able to make through their military aggression, and it would pave the way for Russia to actually take over Ukraine politically in the medium term. The only real difference looking at this plan, which is it's been leaked as over 20 points, is that it throws in some incentives, financial incentives for the US, basically that the US would get to profit substantially out of the reconstruction of Ukraine. Basically, Europe would end up paying for most of it. Some of it also would come from Russian money as well, but nothing like the amount of frozen Russian assets that there are in Belgium, for example, which is what we've had this dispute over the last few years, whether the European Union should seize those assets and give them to Ukraine to defend itself. And also there would be some economic deals between Russia and the US. Russia and US, they don't traditionally do that much trade anyways, in the sense that the US doesn't really need Russia for a lot. Of course, they can make some money out of the trades, but not really substantial. So it's a very curious decision to throw Ukraine under the bus and effectively European security under the bus in the pursuit of a low amount of money from the US's point of view. However, of course, some sort of deal that would lead to a cessation of hostilities would allow Donald Trump to claim that he made peace and he could chase that Nobel Peace Prize. Not so sure that even if Ukraine agreed to this deal that Donald Trump would be likely to win a Nobel Peace Prize, especially with the other things going on in the world that he has been involved in, like, for example, Venezuela. So, looking at the highlights of this plan, basically it would involve Ukraine retreating from positions that it currently holds in the Donbas region. That's the region in the east of Ukraine. Russia changed its constitution to claim that it has a right to parts of Ukraine like Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson Oblast. And they would want the Ukrainians to leave those areas and give a pinky promise that they would not invade once again. Also, there would be what's described as de facto recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea being Russian. There is no such thing as de facto recognition. Either a country de facto controls a territory, which means it is not internationally recognized as a legal control. That would be the case with Crimea at the moment, where Russia claims that it has a de jure right to Crimea since 2014, but in fact it just de facto controls the territory because under international law, you need a lot of countries, the majority of them really, to recognize it as being your territory before legally it becomes your territory, and only a few countries recognize it as Russian. So basically this is a backward way of de jure legally recognizing Russia's annexations and occupations of those territories. There are a lot of other points that are in favor of Russia, which is basically why I described it as being a rehashed version of what they proposed in March 2022. The Ukrainians would have to halve the size of their army, basically. and they would have unspecified security guarantees from the US. Ukraine, in principle, already has security assurances from the US in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for additional security assurances. Not just that Russia invading would have been a violation of international law, but the US is supposed to respond and protect along with the UK. But of course, as we've seen since 2014, when Russia started its invasions of Ukraine, the US and Ukraine's other allies that were a party to the Budapest Memorandum have not done more than strongly worded statements and some military assistance and financial assistance, but they have not intervened to guarantee or assure that Ukrainian territorial sovereignty is protected. So any sort of flimsy security guarantee from the US or Ukraine's other allies wouldn't really hold any water or be convincing and act as an effective deterrent to further Russian aggression. Also, they're not allowed to have foreign troops on Ukraine's territory. As I said, the army would be half, so there we're getting rid of additional deterrences to further Russian aggression. There would have to be elections in Ukraine within 100 days. Well, I think that would probably what Ukraine would do anyways if martial law was ended in that situation. Russia has to become co-official. That would be a way for Russia in the future to increase its influence in Russia or in Ukraine politically and culturally. Also, they have to allow the Russian Orthodox Church to have freedom of establishment in Ukraine. That is a very controversial Kremlin-controlled church that has been accused of espionage in Ukraine. So again, another way to maintain and increase Russian influence in the country and potentially destabilize Ukraine from within. There's only one official language in Ukraine, that is Ukrainian. So as there is in many countries, we have national language. Of course, there can be minority languages, but making Russian official language would be very controversial and not that something that most Ukrainians would be in favor of for apparent, very clear reasons. Other elements to this so-called peace deal would be that there would be a general amnesty, so all war criminals, in particular all Russian war criminals, would basically not be prosecuted. So we've had tens of thousands at the very least of Russian war crimes. The whole war is illegal. All of that doesn't matter according to the White House, because this is a plan that they have back. So basically think of not just leave aside Ukraine's position for a moment, just think of the incentives that gives to aggressive countries in the future. Not only could you gain territory that's not yours and actually have it legally recognized, you could also basically do it in impunity. You wouldn't have to worry about all the war crimes you commit, because when it comes to negotiating, you can just basically have those agreed away. That is not something that would be very good for global security in general. Is actually going to be an incentive for way more war and more horrific war crimes in the future. And in Ukraine's situation, it would be very unpalatable. Basically, this peace plan, again, air quotes for peace plan, it's basically an appeasement plan. And we all saw how that worked out. Appeasement did in the 1930s in Europe. This will be a particularly dangerous appeasement, especially if you look at it in the sense that Russia has not been able to reach its strategic objectives with over 10 years of war in Ukraine. They invaded first in 2014, and then obviously we had the extended invasion in 2022. But they would effectively achieve many of their strategic goals that they've been unable to secure on the battlefield. Remember the old adage from Clausewitz that war is the continuation of politics by other means. And they would do it at the diplomatic table when they are not in a particularly strong situation. That is why it would be referred to as appeasement of Vladimir Putin, and it would create a very dangerous situation in Europe. Not only do we have the incentives for further aggression and Russia being in a better position, also because in Donbass, that territory that they're requesting Ukraine move out of is one of the most heavily fortified areas, and it is a huge problem for Russia to conquer militarily. They're still trying to conquer Petrovsk as I make this video, and they've been outside that city for over a year, and there are several other cities that are heavily fortified. So that would then leave Russia in a better position to attack Ukraine in the very near future once again. On top of that, Russia could temporarily pause the war in Ukraine. There are some other, obviously there would be sanctions released, all that stuff that, Trump is a very big fan of implementing, basically taking all those sanctions off Russia. He said that if Russia violates, they put the sanctions back on again, but that's not a particularly strong incentive to deter Russia because it hasn't deterred them at the moment, so why would one imagine in the future that would act as a significant deterrence? In addition, Russia can redeploy its troops that are currently, its battle-hardened troops that are currently in Ukraine, and they could deploy them somewhere else. Could be a NATO member, they could bring them up to the Baltics and threaten, say, Latvia or Estonia to seize a small town if they don't acquiesce to Russia's demands. Because you got to think of it from Vladimir Putin's point of view. If there's a pause in the fighting in Ukraine, does he want all those soldiers being demobilized and brought back to Russia? Remember, in this peace balance plan, there's no point that says that Russia has to make its army any smaller, just the Ukrainians for some odd reason, the ones that would be defending their own territory in any sort of future conflict. Russia, presumably, Vladimir Putin would have a huge incentive to send them somewhere else, either to test Article 5 of NATO by an increased provocation. We've seen lots of provocations in the last few months against Poland, against Estonia, either with violating their airspace, sending these kind of dummy drones in on a simulated attack run on the country. There was no explosives in those drones. We've seen sabotage attacks on the land of Russia on the rail lines in Poland just in the last few days. So they could escalate that with those battle-hardened troops, and they would be facing on the other side untested troops from the Baltics and from other parts of Europe. And that would obviously create a tinderbox in terms of what could happen next. Or maybe Russia would just take those troops and put them somewhere else. Maybe they'll decide, hey, let's go and put them by agreement because they have friendly relations with the Georgian government at the moment, just put them on the border where Armenia, intimidate Armenia, or somewhere else, or Kazakhstan, or some other country on Russia's borders where they would want to increase their influence, and they could go and use them as a menace somewhere else, or actually launch an invasion somewhere else. So all in all, it would be pretty much a disastrous plan for global security, for European security, and in particular for Ukraine. It's completely unpalatable. And what is surprising, and why I've decided to make this video even talking about such an outrageous plan, is two things. One, it's backed by the White House, which is almost unbelievable. You got Steve Witkoff, who basically comes across as extremely dilettante in his dealings with the Russian Federation. He apparently he's gone to meetings without even a translator with him. He doesn't speak Russian. He doesn't even understand Russia very well. And he has basically taken this plan, which is the Russian appeasement plan or capitulation plan for Ukraine, with a few extra incentives to the US in terms of money, because they would profit from the reconstruction and some business deals in Russia. But the fact that he got that signed off basically as a plan to put forward to the Ukrainians without their input, without European input. Again, Europeans will be expected to pay a lot for the implementation of this plan, but they're not allowed to have a say in it. It's ridiculous. But that's the situation that we're in. And Vladimir Zelensky, surprisingly, when he was meeting with some US military officials, not with the diplomats, agreed that this plan is a basis for some sort of negotiation. Now, obviously in a negotiation they would change the points, but if you're starting from a complete, an effective capitulation to Russia's demands as a starting point, that is a very weak negotiating position, because even if you move it back slightly, it would still be a recipe for future war and Russian aggression in Europe, and globally it would reward a very aggressive imperialist revanchist nation like Russia and incentivize other countries to do so in the near future. What I think will happen, I don't think this plan is going to be accepted. I don't think that it can be a basis for negotiations, real negotiations, in a situation where Ukraine is undefeated on the battlefield and Russia obviously undefeated on the battlefield. Again, war is a continuation of politics by other means, and Ukraine has very little incentive at the moment to accept these terms, unless there is something else going on in the background, like how did the US persuade Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, even accept the premise that he could negotiate based on these terms, when he has previously rejected similar proposals many times from Russia. Maybe there is some threat being used by the US or some sort of other inducement to go along with this for Now, I expect Zelensky to continue to play for time and that this plan will ultimately be rejected. It could be just a framing if we look at it that Trump feels that he cannot get any sort of deal because Russia's and Vladimir Putin just not going to accept any sort of compromise. They believe maybe that they can still win the war, achieve their strategic aims through warfare, and he wants to be able to withdraw the US from the process and just find someone to blame. So he puts this basically ridiculous plan to the Ukrainians. They say no, and then he says, look, the Ukrainians, they don't want peace. Vladimir Putin was going to accept peace if he basically won, was given diplomatically a huge victory. While still the Ukrainians, they just, they won't agree to it. And maybe that is part of the strategy. And that's why Zelensky would want to draw this out so that he doesn't get blamed. That could be one reason. Or there is actually something significantly wrong in the Ukrainian military, perhaps, on the battlefield. We don't see any evidence of that. The Russians are still stuck outside Pokrovsk for over a year, and they claim they have encircled it. They also claim they've captured Kupiansk, but there's no evidence for any of this. They are making some ground in the very south, in Zaporizhzhia Oblast. But again, none of it is that strategic, and none of that suggests the Ukrainian military are about to face some sort of collapse. So unless that is happening behind the scenes, and we just don't see any evidence of it, I don't understand why he would go along with this, unless there is some big strategic inducement for him to play along with this for a while. So my expectation is that this will turn out to be, in the words of Donald Trump, a big nothing burger, but we will spend a lot of time, a lot of energy analyzing and debating it, and it ultimately will not lead anywhere significant. Drop your comments down below. Let me know what you think of this plan and some of the strategies around the world, what all this means for the Russo-Ukrainian war and global security and European security in particular. And I will catch you in the next video. Do побачення.